The age of exploration began with a surge of curiosity and ambition in 15th century Europe. Europe, once isolated, was now building ships that could cross oceans and training navigators to read the stars. The world felt vast and mysterious, but suddenly it seemed within reach. Explorers like Columbus and da Gama set out, not just for adventure, but to find faster trade routes to Asia's riches. Their journeys were perilous. Storms, starvation, and the unknown haunted every voyage. Yet, the promise of gold, spices, and new lands drove them onward. When Europeans landed in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they encountered thriving societies and cultures they'd never imagined. For the indigenous peoples, the arrival of these strangers was equally shocking. A collision of worlds after millennia of separation. These first encounters were tense and uncertain, but they marked the start of a global transformation. The age of exploration wasn't just about new maps, it was a revolution in how Europeans saw themselves and the world. Suddenly, distant lands were accessible, and stories of wealth and opportunity ignited the ambitions of monarchs and merchants. The initial spark of discovery quickly turned into a race for expansion and conquest. The world was about to be redrawn, not just geographically, but politically and economically. The era of pure exploration was ending. The age of colonialism was about to begin. The consequences would shape the planet for centuries to come. Why did European nations risk everything to claim distant lands? The answer: wealth, power, and control. Gold and silver from the Americas made Spain rich beyond imagination, funding armies and palaces. Other nations scrambled to catch up, seeking their own fortunes in new colonies. Trade was another motivator. Why buy spices or sugar when you could own the source? Colonies became plantations for cash crops, enriching Europe while exploiting local labor. Empire was also about prestige. Each colony was a chess piece in a global game of power. Rivalries between Britain, France, and others fueled a relentless competition for territory. Colonies meant more resources, more soldiers, and more influence. There was also the so-called civilizing mission. Europeans claimed a duty to spread their culture and religion. This justified conquest as a noble cause, masking exploitation with a veneer of morality. In reality, colonialism was about extracting wealth and asserting dominance. The race for empire was ruthless, and no major power wanted to be left behind. The stage was set for centuries of global upheaval. Once a colony was claimed, control was enforced through force and cunning. European armies, armed with superior weapons, crushed resistance with brutal efficiency. Divide and rule became a key strategy. Colonizers exploited local divisions, favoring some groups over others to prevent unity. New governments replaced traditional leaders, installing European laws and officials. Locals were often recruited as clerks or soldiers, creating a new social hierarchy based on loyalty to the colonizers. The language of the colonizer became essential for advancement, eroding native languages and cultures. Schools taught European history and values, presenting local traditions as backward. Over time, this bred a sense of inferiority among the colonized, making resistance harder. The colonial system was designed to keep power in foreign hands, with locals dependent and divided. Control wasn't just physical, it was psychological, reshaping identities and aspirations. The machinery of empire was relentless, embedding itself in every aspect of life. Colonial rule was never just about territory, it was about remaking societies from the ground up. The scars of this transformation would last for generations. Colonialism upended every aspect of life for those under its rule. Self-sufficient economies were dismantled, farmers were forced to grow cash crops for export, making communities vulnerable to famine. Traditional leaders lost power, replaced or manipulated by colonial authorities. New social classes emerged, often based on race and proximity to the colonizers. A small elite adopted European ways, while most were relegated to the bottom, fueling deep resentment. Local cultures and religions were suppressed. Missionaries worked to convert and erase indigenous beliefs. Native languages faded as colonial languages dominated schools and government. This wasn't just a loss of words, it was a loss of identity and history. Violence and exploitation were routine forced labor, harsh punishments, and massacres crushed resistance. The wealth extracted from colonies built European cities and industries, but at a terrible human cost. The colonial system drained not just resources, but dignity and hope. Generations grew up in a world where their own heritage was devalued. The legacy of this upheaval still shapes societies today. Colonialism's impact was total, economic, social, and psychological. As empires grew, colonialism became more systematic and ruthless. The British, Spanish, French, Dutch, and Portuguese built global networks for maximum extraction. Central to this system was the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, shipped in horrific conditions, and forced to labor in the Americas. This mass enslavement devastated Africa and fueled European wealth. The ideology of empire evolved too. Religious justifications gave way to racist theories like social Darwinism. These ideas claimed European superiority was natural, masking greed and violence with pseudoscience. Yet, colonial schools inadvertently spread ideas of liberty and self-determination. Educated elites in the colonies began to question why freedom was reserved for Europeans. They read about revolutions and demanded the same rights. The seeds of resistance were planted within the very system meant to control them. The high tide of empire was also the beginning of its undoing. Change was coming, and the world would never be the same. The 20th century saw the collapse of colonial empires. 2 world wars drained Europe's strength and exposed the hypocrisy of colonial rule. Millions of colonial subjects fought for freedom abroad and demanded it at home. The global climate shifted. New superpowers and the United Nations championed self-determination. The moral case for empire crumbled. Holding colonies became indefensible. Charismatic leaders like Gandhi, Nkrumah, and Ho Chi Minh led mass movements for independence. Tactics ranged from non-violent protest to armed struggle, but the momentum was unstoppable. Between the 1940s and 1970s, a wave of decolonization swept the globe. New nations emerged, raising their own flags and hopes. But independence brought challenges, economies still tied to the West, borders drawn without regard for local realities. Ethnic tensions and underdevelopment persisted. The legacy of colonialism was complex and enduring. True freedom would require more than just the end of foreign rule. The struggle for justice and equality continues to this day. Colonialism didn't disappear, it evolved. Today, neo-colonialism operates through economics, not armies. Wealthy nations and corporations control poorer countries with debt, trade deals, and resource extraction. Loans from institutions like the IMF often come with strings attached, forcing cuts to health and education. This keeps former colonies dependent and unable to build strong economies. Control now comes through contracts, not conquest. Cultural dominance is another form. Western media, brands, and values flood the globe. This can erode local cultures and identities, a process called cultural imperialism. The flow of influence is overwhelmingly one way, shaping aspirations and beliefs. Settler colonialism persists too. New populations displace indigenous peoples as seen in places like Israel-Palestine. The methods have changed, but the logic of domination remains. Colonialism's shadow stretches into the present, shaping lives and nations. Understanding this is key to making sense of today's world. The Israel-Palestine conflict is a stark example of modern settler colonialism. Zionist settlers began arriving in the late 1800s, seeking a Jewish homeland in a land already inhabited by Palestinians. The creation of Israel in 1948 led to the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, the Nakba. Villages were destroyed, land was seized, and refugees were barred from returning. The goal was to establish a Jewish majority on historically Arab land. This foundational event still shapes the conflict today. Since 1967, Israeli settlements have expanded into the West Bank, carving up Palestinian territory. These settlements are illegal under international law and make a viable Palestinian state nearly impossible. Palestinians live under military law, while settlers enjoy civil rights, a two-tiered system. Movement, access to resources, and political rights are tightly controlled. The dynamic is one of domination and dispossession, fitting the classic pattern of settler colonialism. Scholars and human rights groups widely recognize this reality. Understanding it is essential to grasping the ongoing struggle in the region. Colonialism's legacy is everywhere, in borders, economies, and minds. Artificial lines drawn by Europeans fuel conflict and instability, especially in Africa and the Middle East. Global inequality is rooted in centuries of wealth extraction, from colonies to Europe and North America. Former colonies still export raw materials and import expensive goods, trapped in cycles of dependency. The scars are psychological too. Racism and cultural loss persist long after independence. Many societies struggle to reclaim suppressed languages, traditions, and identities. Decolonizing the mind means challenging the idea of Western superiority. Understanding colonialism explains today's conflicts and injustices. It's not about blame, but about recognizing how history shapes the present. The echoes of empire are loud in the global economy and ongoing disputes. Honest conversations about this legacy are essential for justice and equity. Only by facing the past can we build a fairer future. The story of colonialism is not over. It's still being written.